This is the Middle East, the Holy Land, the land of the Bible. Here for centuries prophets have walked, nations have collided, and conquerors have come and gone. While Jews claim a 3,000-year-old attachment to this ancient landscape, to these hallowed rocks and stones, Arabs also claim a venerated tradition. In 1993, these two peoples, involved in a tragic conflict that had lasted more than half a century, saw the possibility for a new beginning. It was called the Oslo Agreement and was hailed throughout the world.
We who have fought against you, the Palestinians, we say to you today, in a loud and a clear voice, enough of blood and tears. Enough!
This was the big opening for peace in this part of the world, and gave us, all of us, even all the Arab world, great hopes.
I felt during that period that we are making a historical event, not only for the Palestinians, not only for the Israelis, but for the whole area and for the whole world.
Actually, what we have agreed with Arafat is not about the plan, but about the method. Namely, that instead of fighting each other, we shall have a dialogue between the two of us.
The alternative for the whole Oslo process is sinking into a Bosnian or Belfast type of situation.
The United States must come in. It cannot be just a messenger carrying messages. It must have some ideas. It must offer some expectations.
I've yet to see the Palestinian leadership turn to its constituents and say, well, we're not going to get it all. It's not all feasible. There has to be a tailoring of expectations on their side.
We want to claim a place for Palestine in the 21st century. To do that, we cannot allow Israel to imprison us within the discourse and the vision of the last century.
It has been a difficult road, a very dangerous road, and unfortunately it has been also a very bloody road.
Few places have been as explosive in the past as Israel, the West Bank and Gaza. And few events have aroused such intense reactions as the Oslo peace process and its dramatic fluctuations. Has the moment for hope passed by, or is the dream offered by Oslo still alive? I'm Abba Iban. For 12 years, I was Israel's ambassador to the United Nations and the United States. For 8 years, I served as my country's foreign minister. Besides serving in those official posts, I have spent years trying to promote a peaceful resolution of the conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbors. This had long been an unattainable goal, but in 1993, the agreement signed in Oslo transformed the political realities of the Middle East. In this hour, we shall explore how that remarkable agreement came to be made. We shall also examine the turbulent events that followed, events which have undermined the accord and which are threatening tragically to drive the Arabs and Israelis apart once again. Since the founding of Israel in 1948, there has been continuous conflict between Israel and the Arab states. That conflict has been marked by 6 bitter wars. In 1967, during the Six-Day War with Syria, Jordan and Egypt, Israel captured the West Bank, Sinai and the Gaza Strip. Suddenly, a population of over 1 million Palestinian Arabs, together with their land, was now under Israeli control. At this low point in Arab fortunes, a Palestinian leader emerged, Yasser Arafat. Labeled a terrorist by Israel and the United States, he and his Palestine Liberation Organization called for the eviction of Israel from the captured territories by force of arms. In 1979, Israel and Egypt found a better way. President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin returned Sinai to Egypt by a peace treaty. Though Sadat would pay with his life, assassinated by anti-peace forces in 1982, the peace did hold.
Egypt suffered 10 years after signing the peace agreement with Israel. And then after that, after 1989, everybody realized that Egypt was looking really for peace. Then after the Palestinians started to negotiate, then the Syrians negotiate, the Jordanians signed an agreement, and so the Palestinians.
But if the doors between Tel Aviv and Cairo were open, those between Israel and the West Bank were obstinately shut. The uprising of Arab youth in the West Bank and Gaza was an expression of rage and protest against the Israeli occupation. It was known to the world as the Intifada. The Intifada deeply affected Palestinians like Juma Alian, who was jailed with his 3 brothers. His sister was killed by an Israeli bullet.
Before the Intifada, no one knew what life was really about. We went about things without thinking. We never thought we'd have a country. We never thought we'd have anything of our own. The Intifada gave us pride. I was one of those whose real life began with the Intifada.
For the Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza, the Intifada was a defining moment. It gave them a sense of overriding solidarity. A new and assertive Palestinian identity was coming to birth. Israelis were also growing tired of their role as occupiers. Young soldiers, trained to defend their nation in war, found themselves, to their confusion, aiming their weapons at rock-throwing teenagers. Many Israelis were disillusioned and desperately eager for a solution. When the United States and Russia initiated talks in Madrid and Washington at the end of the Cold War, it seemed one way out. But the talks bogged down as dogmatic assertions and old accusations were repeated. Then in June 1992, a Labour government was elected in Israel on a platform of peace and change. At its head was Yitzhak Rabin, former military chief of staff.
Rabin was the ultimate soldier of Israeli wars, from the War of Independence. So for this man to turn his sword into a plow, to actually move from the battlefield so vigorously to the negotiation table, was a historical moment in the life of this nation.
Madrid had failed. It had failed because Israeli and United States delegates still refused to deal with the PLO, the only authoritative voice of the Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza. But Rabin and Foreign Minister Peres, unlike their predecessors, were determined to pursue new avenues for peace. The way was now open for one of the most intriguing diplomatic accords of recent years, the Oslo Agreements. It was now clear that direct dialogue was needed between the PLO and Israel. But Israelis were even forbidden by law to talk to PLO representatives. The answer, secret talks away from the eyes of the world, is attributed to various sources. Abu Allair, key advisor to the PLO, was the first to suggest Norway as a go-between. Another player was Terry Larsen, a Norwegian working in Gaza who was trusted by both sides.
Abu Allair approached me in Tunis when I went there for the first time to meet Yasser Arafat in November 1992. He asked me if I could approach the government of Norway to finance and facilitate secret meetings between the PLO and the Israeli and official Israeli representatives.
And then Larson came to Tunis and he presented an official invitation to visit Norway, to speak together in a seminar with Hirschfeld and something like that.
Yair Hirschfeld, who led the 2-man Israeli team, was the most unusual player. A Haifa professor with no government ties, he could meet with the PLO without arousing publicity. Secretly, he was reporting to Israeli Deputy Prime Minister Yossi Beilin. One key matter held up the talks: the Israeli ban on contact with the PLO. When this was repealed by the Israeli Knesset, the way to Oslo was open. Secrecy was essential. Any publicity could destroy the fragile trust that had to be built between the parties. The cover used for the talks was that of an academic seminar. But secrecy had its inconveniences.
We were very concerned about secrecy. So the Norwegians asked us, I believe only once, they asked us to have other names in the hotel. And when we came back to the hotel about 1 o'clock at night in Oslo, at the reception, in order to get the key, the lady asked me, "What is your name?" And I looked at her and said, "I'm sorry, but I forgot my name."
Oslo itself was too public a place for the sessions. The private estate of the Beauregard Paper Company, 100 kilometers from Oslo, was chosen as the secret meeting place. Here, talks took place between January and May of 1993.
The first ground-rule was that there would be no protocol. We wouldn't write anything. And everything we said was among us, which meant that whatever we said were ideas we could launch and we could check, and it would be a brainstorming activity, but we could 3 weeks afterwards or 2 months afterwards come back and say, forget it.
With its combination of luxury and inviting simplicity, the Beauregard mansion evoked a world of quiet comfort at the turn of the century. A world where all the usual inhibitions could be dropped.
You know, between us as people, the relations were very good. The difficulty was to develop a relationship to show that while negotiations go on, and the one or the other side takes sometimes a tough position, that it should not have a negative impact on our relations.
From the early beginning, we talked together. I said, look, if we will go back to the history, we'll speak 100 years without results. If you are ready to speak about tomorrow, how we are today, and what we want for tomorrow, I think we may reach an agreement.
But the Palestinians were uncertain whether Hirschfeld was an official Israeli representative.
And then I told them, look, my friend, now it's finished. Whether there will be a representative of the Israeli government, if you will tell me that you are authorized from the Israeli government, it's enough for me. If not, a representative from the Israeli government should come here, or, excuse me, I will not come again.
After soul-searching by Israeli leaders, Uri Savir, Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, was sent to head the discussions. The academic explorations had become official negotiations. The first meetings between Savir and the PLO were held at a ski cottage near Oslo, used by Norwegian cabinet ministers. It was the first time officials of these two peoples had ever met.
I think I was extremely tense. You cannot, in such moments, detach yourself from a certain self-awareness of what you're about to do. I remember in our first walk through the woods around Oslo, we told each other our personal histories. And slowly we developed a common language, which sometimes happens between people, and I think we were lucky to have that chemistry. And being alone and creating a Palestinian-Israeli chemistry really is not only the essence of negotiations, it's also the essence of the agreements that were born out of these negotiations.
As the talks progressed, many difficulties arose.
I remember more than a crisis being happened, but
the most tough one, it was when they want to change even the concept of the Declaration of Principles. At that time, I told them, sorry, I don't think that this channel will be fruitful.
And he stood up and he said, look, I see that we cannot make progress, and I want to announce my personal resignation from this team. And then he went on for about half an hour to talk to his successor, who wasn't in the room. Wished him well, and he would help him, and he was sure that his successor would do better. I wasn't quite sure if he was bluffing or if he was honest. Until this very day, I'm not.
The sticking point was Israel's insistence that it retain control of West Bank security. Israel worried over Arafat's commitment. Lassen had visited him and was questioned by the Israelis on every nuance.
We were grilled by Mr. Peres and his associates, I was about to say nearly literally, about every word Arafat had said, again and again and again. How did he put it? What did he say? Was that exactly what he said? How did he emphasize? Can you repeat it? Can you go through it once again? Do you believe him? Can we trust him?
As trust grew, both sides compromised as they moved toward reconciliation and mutual recognition. In August, Shimon Peres, on a visit to Scandinavia, met secretly with his team, Terry Larsen and Norway's Foreign Minister, Jørgen Holst. A phone call was placed to PLO headquarters in Tunisia.
The telephone went on for 6 hours uninterruptedly between Tunisia, where Arafat and his friends were, and Stockholm, where I was staying. And until the last moment, we didn't reach an agreement. I could have heard through the telephone, you know, the joy, the tears, the doubts that took place on the other side of the line.
I called to Tunis, and Mr. Holst congratulated Mr. Arafat, and I also took the phone and congratulated both Arafat and Abu Allah, and I could hear both their voices trembling with emotion.
That time we thought that, well, this is the first step toward achieving the Palestinian rights and to build Palestinian-Israeli peace.
The negotiations had lasted 8 months. Now an agreement of principles would be signed secretly in Oslo.
And at the initialing of the agreement, I think I had a very strange feeling. It was a contrast between a group of about a dozen people in a small room, the curtains closed, a secret video camera of the Norwegian police taking pictures, and doing something totally clandestine, which had enormous historical repercussions.
The Declaration of Principles bound Israel and the Palestinians to a 5-year interim agreement. Power over Gaza and Jericho would be transferred to the Palestinians. Economic programs would be developed and a new port built. Resolution of the harder questions like Jerusalem would be left for a permanent status agreement to be concluded within 5 years. On September the 13th, 1993, Yitzhak Rabin and Chairman Arafat met on the green lawns of the White House. The implacable enemies were about to sign a declaration for peace. The negotiations that had started in the darkest secrecy were now confirmed before the astonished eyes of the world. The Oslo agreements and the spectacular handshake of Rabin with Arafat electrified the world, and the Israeli Prime Minister, shaking hands with one of his country's most hate-filled enemies, was unimaginable, but it had happened. Both sides were embarking on a venture of mutual trust. The trust had been born outside the official channels. It was an outgrowth of the friendships that had developed over the long months together in the Norwegian countryside. But now, for the accords to succeed, that trust would have to be defended, nurtured and shared by the Israeli and Palestinian peoples. In the months that followed, there was a sense of eager anticipation. Israel had ruled Gaza for 3 decades. Oslo brought that occupation to an end. When Arafat entered Gaza 9 months after the White House meeting, he was treading on Palestinian soil for the first time in 30 years. He had been driven from Jordan in 1972. He had been exiled to Tunis in 1982. Now he was returning in triumph to a hero's welcome.
The day Arafat came into Gaza, we were so happy. He obtained so much for us. He gave us a land where we Palestinians can talk, move, and breathe clean, free air.
The events of the year also brought a host of unexpected benefits for the Israelis. The Arab economic boycott, which had lasted 40 years, was suspended. More astounding was the changed attitude to Israel in the Arab world. Once a pariah, Israel was now courted by the Gulf Emirates and taking a major part in regional economic conferences. In this period of euphoria, a highly significant development was the warming of relations between Israel and Jordan. Though technically still at war, their border had been quiet for years. Now, the path was open for peace. In October 1994, nearly a year after the meeting of Rabin and Arafat, Israel and Jordan officially ended nearly 5 decades of enmity.
An unusual day, a day like no other, in terms of the hopes, in terms of the promise, and in terms of the determination.
The peace that was born today gives us all the hope that the children born today will never know war between us, and their mothers will know no sorrow.
After Jordan, it is Syria that now holds the key to regional peace. Israel's new partnership with other Arab states encouraged Syria to negotiate for the return of the Golan Heights, captured by Israel in the Six-Day War. Though inconclusive, these talks were an important step forward.
You cannot exclude Syria from the peace process, otherwise, I could tell you very frankly, we will never reach comprehensive settlement.
I perceive peace with Syria, if it could be achieved without violating our security interests, as putting an end to the era of wars here in the Middle East. We put the cornerstone in the peace with Egypt, and we have to put the keystone on the top of this arc in peace with Syria.
The post-Oslo response of the Arab world to Israel was one of the most remarkable elements of the drama. The rewards of the agreement were many-fold. Over 100 new countries expressed their willingness to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. Foreign investment swelled. Never had the country stood higher in world esteem. However, the peace accords had many furious enemies: Israeli settlers, as well as Arab radicals. At first, the adversaries of the accords were careful not to trumpet and declaim their dissent from a diplomatic achievement so universally celebrated, but the time would come when they would take action, and it would be explosive. The main Arab opposition to the Oslo agreements is rooted in the militant Hamas and Islamic Jihad movements. Both groups call for total Israeli withdrawal from the occupied lands. In Gaza, Razi Hamed edits the local Hamas newspaper.
All the time they see that Israel is ready to withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza Strip and to give the Palestinians more freedom and more independence, but it's not here. Nothing. Now I cannot go to the West Bank. I cannot go to the beach without an Israeli checkpoint.
In Israel, the minority opposing the agreement includes the ultra-nationalists and many of the religious right, like Gershon Bar Kokhba.
Giving up territory is in total opposition and conflict with the ideals of the Land of Israel movement. I feel as if Oslo has wrenched away part of my body. Part of the body of Israel has been torn away, and it hurts very much.
On both sides, religion inflamed emotions, a dangerous combination that would again and again bring the peace process to the brink of annihilation. The first spark of explosive dissent ignited in Hebron at the Tomb of the Patriarchs, a building sacred to both Jews and Arabs. Early in 1994, Baruch Goldstein, a religious Jew, opened fire with an automatic rifle. 29 Arabs were killed while at prayer. Goldstein was clubbed to death in the ensuing melee.
The massacre in Hebron to us was a very, very serious, not just a human tragedy and the loss of life, but was a very clear proof, indication that so long as you have extreme ideological hardline settlers in the heart of Palestinian cities, so long as you have areas of proximity and friction, you are always going to have problems.
In April 1995, in response to the Hebron killings, 2 Arab suicide bombers blew up Jewish buses in Israel. 14 died and 72 were injured. Israelis were stunned and enraged. Though bombs and death struck in the cities, the root of the crisis lay in the occupied territories. The Israel-Palestinian dispute is about many things, but at its center is a dispute about land, about 2 peoples' claims to the same territory, the West Bank. For many Palestinians, Oslo did not offer enough. Heidi Abdel Shafi was one of the original Arab negotiators in Madrid.
Our position is that Israel's presence in the occupied territories is illegal. We claim all the occupied territories, including East Jerusalem, and so that's what would make for peace.
In 1977, Israeli Jews had been encouraged by the new right-wing Likud government to settle in the West Bank. Since then, their number has grown to over 120,000 settlers. Surrounding them in small towns and hundreds of villages live over 1 million Arabs. Many of the Jewish settlers are deeply religious. Some belong to fervent nationalist groups like Gush Emunim, the Bloc of the Faithful.
The settlement itself from within is rather insular. So in that respect, we don't really feel any sort of pressure or fear. But I think that what bothers us more than anything is feeling isolated politically, world opinion being so directed against us.
Most settlers feel a deep bonding between themselves, the Bible, and Jewish historical roots in the area. Dov Weinstock returned to the West Bank in 1967. Recently, his eldest son was shot by 2 Arabs. Nothing will move him from this place.
The link between my people and this land is closer, harder, stronger than any other people has with its land. If a people has been in existence for 2,000 years and decides to return, you can see the proof of its bonding with its land.
Despite worldwide criticism of their actions, the settlers believe fervently that their occupation of the land is justified historically and legally. The prospect of Arab rule on the West Bank struck at the settlers' very existence. In the heat of summer of 1995, the settlers poured out to protest the planned expansion of Palestinian self-rule. Their intention was plain: to reduce the areas available for Palestinian self-government. When Rabin ignored the protests, the volume was increased to an ominous pitch. By autumn, the rallies spread to the cities as the opposition Likud party and the right organized increasingly hostile demonstrations. The country was split. For many in the opposition, the peace process had gone too far, too fast. From day to day, the right-wing protests against Oslo grew in incitement and hysteria. Yitzhak Rabin, the Prime Minister, became the object of abuse and vilification. He was called a Nazi and a traitor by the extreme right. In an atmosphere of growing tension, Labour responded with a massive rally for peace in Tel Aviv. The date, November the 4th, 1995. At a few seconds past 10 p.m., Yitzhak Rabin, Israel's Prime Minister, was shot dead by a religious law student opposed to the peace process. Devastated by grief, for days the country mourned. Rabin's death was a loss not just to Israel, but to the world.
As long as I live, I'll be proud to have known him, to have worked with him as a brother, and as a friend, and as a man.
Even in your hour of darkness, his spirit lives on, and so you must not lose your spirit. Your Prime Minister was a martyr for peace, but he was a victim of hate. Surely we must learn from his martyrdom that if people cannot let go of the hatred of their enemies, they risk sowing the seeds of hatred among themselves.
The shots that killed Yitzhak Rabin caused shame and shock throughout Israel. Shock because the assassination of a head of government was not something people believed could happen in Israel. Shame because the assassin was not alone, but represented a segment of the Israeli nation, Jewish fundamentalists, who believed that no government had the right to compromise with the captured territories. Rabin had been murdered in an attempt to halt the peace process. Initially, the effect was just the reverse. The opposition was shocked into silence. 4 more West Bank cities were handed over to the PLO with scarcely a murmur from the right. 3 months after Rabin's death, one of the key events called for by Oslo took place. The Palestinians held their first elections. Although much of the fundamentalist opposition boycotted the event, this was a truly pivotal moment, the start of representative government. Eventually, 88 people were elected to a new legislative council headed by Yasser Arafat. It was 2.5 years since the Oslo Accords. Gaza had been the most bitter and contentious area under the Israeli occupation. Though the refugee camps still festered and it was a place of squalor and poverty, a new spirit was felt in Gaza as it came under Arab administration. Where Israelis had patrolled, order was now kept by Palestinian police. Where housing had stagnated, there was now a building boom. In opinion polls, over 70% of the Palestinians supported the peace process. A people manipulated for years by Israel and Arab states was now establishing a national identity. There were also disappointments. Millions of dollars had been promised in international development funds, but little money was actually arriving. The new Palestinian government, too, often proved ineffective.
The government is heedless of the council's decisions. The process is not going the way that we wished it will go to move to realize democratic change.
There were also complaints against Israel.
I'm sorry to say that they are not fulfilling and not implementing accurately and honestly what had been agreed upon and what had been signed in the White House in Washington.
Oslo had promised change, possible statehood, a new Palestinian dawn. But 90% of the West Bank was still in Israeli hands. The Palestinian goal was still frustratingly distant. Now a series of events would rock the very foundations of peace. For months, Israel had pursued Yehi Ayash, who had masterminded the suicide bus bombings in Israel. Ayash was assassinated by a telephone bomb, an act widely attributed to the Mossad, the Israel Secret Service. The shock of Ayash's death fueled rage and fury throughout the West Bank. Hamas and Islamic Jihad now promised revenge and violent retribution.
Israelis now, till now, they did not understand any language out of language of force. We are living under the occupations. And from the international community, and the international laws, and from United Nations resolutions, we have the right to resist against the occupation.
In 1 week of horror, between February the 25th and March the 3rd, 1996, 3 Israeli buses and an industrial center were blown up by suicide bombers. 60 people were killed and over 150 injured. The purpose of the attacks was clear. Islamic militants had found their moment to act, to destroy the peace process.
I think that Hamas was surprised after the signing of the Oslo agreements that Arafat wanted to change the map, the political map here. Hamas decided to go on its strategy, an armed struggle against Israel. And Arafat now said frankly that his strategy is the peaceful solution.
Arafat was now pitted against Hamas, trying to demonstrate to the world his commitment to act against terrorism. At West Bank and Gaza checkpoints, the Israelis, fearful of more attacks, now sealed the borders. 80,000 Arabs, dependent for their livelihood on work in the Israeli cities, were left without means of subsistence. For the Arabs, the desperate situation brought a harvest of bitterness. On the Israeli side, the turbulence and bombings caused a resurgence of the anti-peace forces. Shimon Peres, Rabin's successor, called for national elections in June. The convulsive events of that spring would have major consequences for the entire region. The appeal of the Oslo Accord lay in its promise of peace and security for Israel. Hamas, as an opponent of Oslo, understood this well. When security is the dominant issue, bombs in buses make devastating negative arguments. Many Israelis, enraged by the terrorist acts, began thinking precisely as the terrorists wanted them to think. Israelis saw Arafat as unwilling or unable to control the violence. They saw the Labour government as unable to guarantee their individual security. Instead of moving toward peace, many felt they were moving toward disaster. The campaigns for the Israeli elections focused on two issues: peace and security, whether to proceed with the peace process or to slow it down. Prime Minister Shimon Peres argued for continuing Rabin's policies. An intense believer in the Oslo Accords, he stressed the advantages of peace and the danger of yielding to terrorist-inspired fear. Confronting him as the new head of the right-wing Likud was Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu had served in a top army battle unit and had later acted as Israeli ambassador to the United Nations.
Having failed in all the violent means.
He was distrustful of Arafat and vehemently opposed to the idea of a Palestine state. He argued that only his leadership and a slowdown in Oslo could end Palestinian violence and guarantee Israeli security. In a breathtakingly close election, Benjamin Netanyahu was elected prime minister by a margin of 0.5%.
Essentially, the mandate that I was given was to bring peace with security, which is, I believe, the only peace that we can have. Now, it's not easy, because the other side has learned, has fashioned a model that says that every time we have disagreements, which are inevitable in the negotiation process, first of all, they describe this as a gloom and doom. We're about to descend into a general cataclysmic war in the Middle East, and they beat these drums of gloom and often the drums of war. And secondly, they unleash violence and often encourage terror. And of course, that is unacceptable.
Among those who had voted for Netanyahu were the settlers and the religious right. Given the small margin of his victory, their support was crucial to him. Most were opposed to Oslo. The peace process could proceed only with Netanyahu's backing. But his actions were ambivalent. Nowhere was this more evident than in Hebron, where a promised Israeli withdrawal was delayed for months. Hebron has long been the center of passion and controversy. Arabs remember the murders committed by Baruch Goldstein, while Israelis are still haunted by the massacre of Jews in 1929. Today, Hebron is a divided city. Here, in 3 tiny enclaves, 500 Jews cling passionately to their ancient heritage in the town.
Hebron represents the roots of the people of Israel. When Abraham, our father, came to Israel, the first place he bought land was Hebron. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the forefathers of our people, from 3,500 years ago, they came to this place and lived here exactly in the area behind us. I see myself as part of the thread of Jewish history, living where the link in the chain is weakest, and for me, that is Hebron.
Yet Hebron is primarily an Arab city. Many of its 120,000 inhabitants see the Jewish presence very differently.
I think the situation in Hebron is entirely untenable. It is a powder keg. It's a very explosive situation. It's a very visible and concrete expression of injustice, and therefore will perpetuate a sense of grievance among Palestinians.
After months of delay and disputes in his cabinet, Netanyahu finally gave the order: withdraw from 3/4 of the city, but safeguard the Jewish remnant. The Jewish settlers remain, their position tenuous, their fears increasing. Hebron continues to be volatile, a place where enmity and mistrust prevent solutions, and time is running out. The Oslo Accord calls for a final agreement by May 1998 on matters far more complicated than Hebron, such as boundaries, new settlements, and refugees. Arafat has told me that the complex problem of Jerusalem can wait till the final settlement stage, but that date is ominously close. There have been many cities divided by politics or theology: Beirut, Berlin, Belfast. But the problems of Jerusalem may be graver than any of these. Sacred to Jews, Christians and Muslims, the city is built on explosive myths. Called the City of Peace, here national ambitions and religious traditions have collided through the centuries. From 1948 to 1967, Jerusalem was a divided city. Jews in the west, Arabs in the east. Barriers and a no-man's land separated the two. In June 1967, the Israelis conquered eastern Jerusalem in the Six-Day War. Barriers came down. Jews once again had access to their holiest site, the western wall of the Second Temple. Jerusalem was declared the eternal and indivisible capital of the Jewish state. Palestinians are equally determined that the east of the city become the capital of an independent Arab state. Jerusalem has a deep spiritual meaning for Muslims. It was from here, the site of the Dome of the Rock, that Muhammad is believed to have ascended to heaven.
It is not just spiritual to us. Jerusalem is very concrete. It is a symbol and an expression of our continuity, of our culture, of our history, of our roots, of our authenticity, and geographically it is in the heart of Palestine. And therefore we feel that symbolically it is also in the heart of every Palestinian in many ways, and every Arab.
I think that we should draw a distinction between political sovereignty and religious sovereignty. Now, Jerusalem has been the capital of the Jewish people and of no other people for the last 3 millennia. The holiest city for Islam is Mecca, but it is not the capital of Saudi Arabia.
Jerusalem is a difficult issue and easy issue. And I cannot imagine that there will be a solution for this conflict without an acceptable solution by both parties for Jerusalem.
The proximity of two faiths vying for control of Jerusalem has made for confrontation. Here, a spark can set off a conflagration. One such spark was the opening of a tunnel near the Dome of the Rock in September 1996. Seen by some Arabs as an attack on the dome itself, Palestinian anger against Israel exploded in Jerusalem and throughout the West Bank. Under the Oslo Accords, Israel had agreed to the arming of the Palestine police. Now, those weapons were turned back against Israelis. In 3 days of bloody confrontation, more than 60 Arabs were killed and 16 Israelis. The partnership forged in Oslo was shattered by conflict. It was an ominous sign.
Mr. Netanyahu had frozen everything. All the negotiations, all the talks, all the committees, everything had been frozen.
In an atmosphere of increasing bitterness, President Clinton and King Hussein tried to mediate the damage. Progress would require restoring trust between Israelis and Palestinians. In early 1997, the Israeli government permitted construction of a Jewish settlement in the south of Jerusalem. Arabs saw this as a direct threat to their hopes for a capital. Confrontation now became the norm. In Hebron, Jews and Arabs once again faced each other in the angry streets. In a crowded Jerusalem market, another Arab suicide bombing took 14 lives and wounded more than 100 people.
I say this to anyone who asks me. This land is bitter with blood. Jew, Christian, Arab. Here blood was spilt before 67, after 67, and it will be spilt again after Oslo.
People have to feel that a change has occurred, that there is mutual respect, that the atmosphere is a different one of people trying to search together and build something worthy of them together in the times ahead.
By the summer of 1997, negotiations between the two sides had come to a halt. American and foreign initiatives to restart them proved immensely difficult. In an atmosphere of mistrust, positions hardened.
We have to have the global universal recognition of statehood, of sovereignty. There definitely is going to be a Palestinian state. We may have had our ups and downs on the way, but I know in the long run this is a right.
If you ask me point blank on a Palestinian state, then I tell you I'm against it because I don't want those powers to accrue to our neighbors in such a way as to threaten the peace.
The men of Oslo struggled to change images, to alter perceptions of each other. Their hopeful vision of the future is in danger of being cast aside.
There is a need for a daring leadership that will invest its own political capital in bridging the gaps that are still there between the peoples.
But time is slipping, time is passing, sir, and we need to move, and we need the United States to help us, and we need the rest of the world to pay attention to this area. We've covered so much ground, and we need all the goodwill in the world, and we need ourselves to speak loudly and clearly. No more wars, no more destruction, no more despair.
We are once again at a point of crisis. Yet I still believe the Middle East has been irreversibly transformed by the peace process. Things have been said that were never said before. Things have been done that were never done before. And written peace commitments have been exchanged. There are, however, no guarantees for the future. Dedicated opponents of peace can still dismantle the accords bit by bit until every element of friendship, trust and cooperation has been undone. If they do, it will be a tragedy for Palestinians and Israelis alike. The unique convergence of events and personalities that made Oslo possible may never recur. The success of the peace process may not lead to utopia, but it will stop the endless cycle of wars and violence. For both Israelis and Palestinians, a path has been shown in which the opportunities transcend the dangers. It is a difficult path and daunting, but unless it is vigorously pursued, generations might pass before anyone will attempt such a peace process again.
Major funding for this program was provided by Carl Ash. The Charles H. Revson Foundation, Incorporated. The Center for Middle East Peace and Economic Cooperation, the Leon and Gina Fromer Philanthropic Fund, and Mr. and Mrs. Ted Mann. Additional funding was provided by the following: